And what I found in putting out my opinion on Ukraine is that I irritated an awful lot of people. A lot of people out there went, we disagree with you. Fundamentally, we disagree with you viscerally, which is okay. I really don't mind that. Because again, this is America, freedom of speech. I get to say what I want, you get to hold me accountable for it. That's wonderful. But that's not what happened. You see, suddenly in July 14th of last year, I was made aware of a conference that was held in Kiev. A conference that was put forward by the United States State Department. They sponsored it. And the conference involved this entity called the Center for Countering Disinformation. It's an office belonging to the President of Ukraine, and it says we exist to counter Russian propaganda. So far, so good. I don't have a problem. Except they published a list called a blacklist. And on that list, I featured prominently. I was called an information terrorist. I was called a war criminal. I was told that I should be arrested and prosecuted for crimes against humanity. Now, it doesn't bother me so much that the Ukrainians are doing this because they're a sovereign nation. They get to do what they want to do. What bothered me is that the US taxpayer was footing the bill for that. The US taxpayer was footing the bill based upon money allocated by the United States Congress in a bill passed in May of 2021, sending aid to Ukraine. Now, I don't know, when I read the Constitution in the First Amendment, it says that Congress shall not pass laws that abridge free speech. Well, I think Congress passing a law allocating money to Ukraine so that Ukraine, under the auspices of the State Department, can form a Center for Countering Disinformation designed to intimidate and threaten American citizens from engaging in their First Amendment responsibilities and rights, sort of violates the Constitution. And I felt strongly about it that I wrote a letter to my congressional representatives. I wrote to Chuck Schumer, I wrote to Gillibrand, and I wrote to Paul Tonko. Schumer and Gillibrand, they didn't respond, didn't expect them to. Tonko did, but it was a boilerplate letter. And the interesting thing about this letter is even though he addresses my concern about the resolution allocating the money, he didn't address the issue at all about me being put on a blacklist. Instead, he simply said that he condemns Vladimir Putin's unprovoked war against Ukraine. It's a clear violation of international law, and on and on and on and so forth. Another list that I got put on because of this CCD taxpayer-funded thing was something called the Mirotvorets list. I don't know if you're familiar with it. It's literally a hit list. It's a death list. They kill people on that list. Oh, really? Daria Dugina didn't die on that list. Her name wasn't there. They didn't put a line through her face. They liquidated. They don't brag about this. They kill people. And it's run by the SBU, which is the Ukrainian Intelligence Service.
How many people were killed?
A lot of people were killed on that list. But we can talk about this any way you want. My name's on the list. You can't deny that. People whose names on the list are targeted for death. You can't deny that. So there we are. And again, U.S. taxpayer money being used to fund this. Now, why do I bring this up? One, I'd like Paul Tonko held accountable for this. He is my representative. He voted for money to be allocated to the Ukrainian government for the purpose of suppressing my free speech, either by intimidation, calling me an information terrorist, seeking to have me arrested as a war criminal, or transferring my name to the Mirotvorets hit list so that maybe somebody will kill me. But the other thing is, I'm bringing it up because in his response to me, Tonko talked about Vladimir Putin's illegal war of aggression in violation of international law. You know, we can talk all day about the war in Ukraine. We can talk about U.S. money being provided to them. We can talk about what's going on the battlefield. We can agree or disagree. You know, did Russia try and take Kiev in February and March? That's up for debate. Was it a game-changing event when the United States provided tens of billions of dollars worth of equipment to the Ukrainian military, enabling them to launch counteroffensives in Kharkov and Kherson? Are the Russians incompetent? Are the Ukrainians incompetent? Are people dying in large numbers on the Russian side, on the Ukraine side? It all can be discussed, but really that's sort of over here. The key element here is who is on the right side of history? Who is on the right side of history? Where do the players in this fall when it comes to international law? And Paul Tonko clearly believes that Russia's on the wrong side of history, that Russia has violated international law. To assess that, why don't we take a look at the Russian claim? Russia claims that the justification for its actions in Ukraine are found in the United Nations Charter, specifically Article 51, which is the self-defense charter. Now, people are going to say, hey, Scott, Russia attacked Ukraine, so how can it be self-defense? Good question, except when you study international law, you understand that self-defense includes a clause called preemptive self-defense, meaning that you don't have to sit there and get punched in the face, that if somebody's getting ready to knock you in the teeth, you get to take them right out. Boom, preemptive self-defense. But the key aspect to that is, A, it has to be an imminent threat to you, and B, the fighting in the Donetsk is not Russia. It's not Russia. The fighting in the Donbass is in Ukraine. It's an internal Ukrainian problem. So how does Russia justify self-defense by intervening in Ukraine? Geez, I don't know. Maybe what happened is Lugansk and Donetsk held a referendum, declared independence. That independence was recognized by Russia, and then Russia engaged in something called collective security arrangement. The reason why I bring that up is that Russia didn't invent this concept. The United States invented this concept in 1999. How do you think we justified NATO intervention against Serbia in 1999? Collective self-defense under Article 51 of the United Nations Charter, citing the imminent threat posed by the Serbians to the population of Kosovo through genocidal activities. And therefore, NATO, wait a minute, NATO's not a member of the United Nations. How can NATO possibly cite the United Nations Charter to justify military action? Because they're engaged in a collective security agreement with the United States, who is a member of the United Nations. Just like Russia is a member of the United Nations, Lugansk and Donetsk are not, but once they enter a collective security arrangement, it becomes a legitimate thing. So Russia has a case under international law. We can debate it, people can disagree with me, but the notion straight up, the Pomtonko says Russia is in clear violation of international law. I'm telling you right now, it ain't that black and white. Russia's articulated a clearly cognizable case under Article 51 of the United Nations Charter that it is carrying out preemptive self-defense against a threat posed by the Ukrainians. Now here comes the important part, because people are going to say, well, Scott, doesn't the threat have to be real? Doesn't it have to be imminent? And you're right. In order for all of this to work, the threat posed by Russia has to be real, or by Ukraine has to be real, and it has to be imminent. Let's back up for a second. April 2008, a gentleman named William Burns, at the time he was the U.S. ambassador to Russia, wrote a memorandum to the President of the United States. That memorandum was titled, Niet means Niet, no means no. Pretty straightforward. What was the memorandum about? He basically said, if NATO invites Ukraine to join NATO, it will lead to a escalation of tensions between Russia and Ukraine and the West that will inevitably result in a Russian military intervention that will cause Ukraine to lose the Donbass and Crimea. April 2008 is when this memorandum was written. The United States ambassador to Russia, one of the top experts about Russia in the United States, is warning the U.S. government that if we invite Ukraine in, the ultimate outcome will be a conflict between Russia and Ukraine that results in Ukraine losing significant portions of its territory. It's not guesswork, ladies and gentlemen. We said right up April 2008, that's what's going to happen. November 2008, we invite Ukraine to join NATO, which means that we knew through that invitation what was going to happen. It's not a surprise. We knew that by inviting Ukraine into NATO, it would lead to a escalation of tension that would result in Russian military intervention. Was it inevitable? No, but we knew we were setting up the case. 2014, a coup. Now some people take issue with that. They call it a revolution. I call it a coup. It's an unconstitutional effort to overthrow the constitutionally elected government of Viktor Yanukovych by people who did not have legal constitutional authority to do so. The right sector and other far-right elements supported by the United States. I mean, it is Victoria Nuland, after all, who was a senior State Department official who was intercepted on the phone bragging about her boy Yatsenko, America's choice to be Prime Minister of Ukraine. Why is it America's choice? I mean, after all, isn't Ukraine a sovereign state? Why is the United States deciding who's going to be leading it. Because it ain't about the Ukrainian people or the will of Ukraine. It's about the United States seeking to weaken Russia by overthrowing a pro-Russian government, Viktor Yanukovych, and replacing it with Ukrainian nationalists who would be working on behalf of the United States. Now we get the conflict. In August, September of 2014, the conflict in Donbass is on fire. In early August, the Ukrainian army went in and threatened to surround the Donetsk militias. It looked like it was going to be game, set, match Ukraine. But then superior forces, which probably included some Russian military, counterattacked and surrounded them. Now it's game, set, match Russia. 10,000 Ukrainian soldiers surrounded, and they ain't going to get out. They're all going to die. So what happens? The Ukrainians get together with their European allies and say, please help us negotiate a settlement. Angela Merkel, the Chancellor of Germany, flies all over the place. She meets with Hollande, the President of France, and they meet with the Russians, they meet with OSCE, they meet with Ukrainians, and they come up with the Minsk Accords. The Minsk Accords. Now, the first one in Minsk 2014 has some difficulty. In 2015, they solidified it up, but the bottom line of the Minsk Accords is this. There will be a ceasefire. During that ceasefire, the border will be brought under control by the Ukrainian government because Russia had no territorial objectives in Ukraine. Russia said that the Donbass is Ukraine, sovereign Ukraine. But in order for this to happen, Ukraine must pass constitutional amendments that protect the rights of ethnic Russians in Ukraine. The same people who were burned to death in Odessa, the same people who were slaughtered in Mariupol, slaughtered in the Donbass, their rights need to be protected. This was agreed to by Ukraine, by Germany, by France. Agreed to. They took this to the United Nations Security Council and they said, give us a resolution that backs this up because we're all serious about this. How serious were they? Minsk was never, ever implemented by Ukraine. And Germany and France did not put pressure on Ukraine to implement it. Russia was begging for implementation all through the 8 years, all the way up to the end. When Joe Biden met with Vladimir Putin in Geneva, one of the key talking points was Putin turning to Biden and saying, if you want all this to go away, implement Minsk. And Biden said, I promise you we will do that. I'm tasking Tony Blinken, the Secretary of State, to get this done. It didn't get done. Why? We now know why. Exhibit A, Petro Poroshenko, former president of Ukraine, gives a speech in which he says, it was a sham. A sham. Minsk was never serious. We only did Minsk to buy time to build up the Ukrainian military so that we could militarily defeat the Russians. So in 2014, 2015, instead of seeking peace, we now know that Ukraine was actually buying time to go to war against whom? Russia. That's okay, that's Poroshenko speaking. He's a nationalist, he's a little fanatic. Maybe we don't take his words too seriously. Angela Merkel gives an interview after she leaves office. She says the same thing. Minsk was a fraud, a sham, to buy time for NATO to train the Ukrainian military. For what purpose? To defeat the Russians. And now Hollande, the French president, says the same thing. Ladies and gentlemen, the Ukrainians, the French, the Germans, NATO, the United States were never serious about peace. From 2008 until 2022, they focused on one thing and one thing only, creating the conditions for the Ukrainian military to engage and defeat the Russian military for the purpose of, one, liberating, from their point of view, the Donbass, and two, pushing the Russians out of Crimea. Now, this is intent. Where's the action? 2015, the United States sets up a major training base in western Ukraine. In that training base, we trained 1 battalion of Ukrainian troops every 55 days for 7 straight years. 30,000 Ukrainian troops were trained to NATO standards and equipped. For what purpose? The U.S. Army puts out a slide and brags about it. We train the Ukrainians here, and they draw an arrow so they can go and fight the Russians here. This was never about peace, ladies and gentlemen. So now we come to what happened on February 24th of last year. Was this an unprovoked war of aggression, as Paul Tonko claims? Or did Russia actually have a case for legitimate self-defense, preemptive self-defense? And I would say that if NATO has trained a Ukrainian force of 60 to 90,000 men, the intent of which is to go to war against Russia, even though you have a Minsk Accord that says we're not going to do that, the intent is quite clear. Now, we can debate this, we can disagree with this, but my point is it's not black and white. It's not a, just an easily shut case. You can't sit there and say, no, Russia's wrong, Ukraine's right. That's not how it works. But here's the other thing about that. There's no more trust between Russia and the West. None whatsoever. Now, initially, it was because the West said Russia violated international law, carried out an unprovoked act of aggression against Ukraine. But now we see it's a little bit murkier than that. The West was never serious about peace. Never serious about peace. The Minsk Accords mean nothing. Merkel's signature means nothing. Hollande's signature means nothing. Poroshenko's signature means nothing. The West means nothing. And why is this important? Because Russia has thermonuclear warheads, ladies and gentlemen. So does the United States. NATO has nuclear weapons. Russia's now extended its nuclear umbrella into Belarus. If this thing goes hot between NATO and the United States, the world ends. It's that simple. There's no such thing as limited nuclear war. There is no such thing as limited nuclear war. If there is a nuclear exchange between Russia and the United States, we all die.